What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Shout of Buffalo Bills Football Podcast. I am Matt Parrino, live in Palm Beach, Florida, the site of the NFL's annual meeting, alongside, as always, Ryan Talbot. And we're going to bring you the latest on the Buffalo Bills, hearing from Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane over the course of the last 24 hours. A lot to dive into. It is pretty beautiful out here, Ryan. How are things back in Olean?
Little chilly. It was warm this morning and it's dropped about 10 degrees since then. So definitely jealous of the backdrop that you're dealing with. But obviously you're there for work and there's plenty to talk about after you talked with Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott.
There really is. And I think the place that we have to start is what I think was a very blunt and direct Brandon Beane yesterday when he was asked about what the latest situation is with James Cook, who is one of the 5 players without a current contract extension that's going into the final year of his rookie deal. You think about Benford, Bernard, Rousseau, and Shakir all signed to long-term extensions this offseason. James Cook is not in that department. And when asked about it yesterday, Brandon Beane basically said, we've moved on to the draft. And when he made it sound like there were ongoing conversations, and who knows, maybe even James Cook was one of the first people that the Bills talked to about a possible extension this offseason of the eligible ones, but the numbers just never made sense on both sides. So Brandon Beane said, listen, we moved on to other players that maybe were a little bit more willing to meet what the Bills wanted to do. James Cook has been out there very bluntly on his own right, saying that he thinks that he should be getting $15 million per season. And at this point, they're not looking at an extension.
Right. And listen, I mean, he has every right to go out there and publicly state his wishes and his demands for a new contract. But you sit here and you look at everyone eligible for a new deal. And it's no coincidence that every player that's kind of remained quiet on the front and on the matter now has a new deal. You talk about Khalil Shakir. Comes in under average, but not greatly under the average of what some were projecting for him. Greg Rousseau at $20 million seems like a great deal for the Bills based on the way that number keeps escalating for the edge rushers, pass rushers. Terrell Bernard, obviously Josh Allen, he wasn't really part of that conversation in the offseason. These were guys who were entering the final year of their deals. And now you get Christian Benford, your number 1 cornerback. So after going public with his demands, we're sitting here and now it's clear the Bills have said, okay, it's not going to work out at this time, but that doesn't mean that that's the end of Cook's tenure with the Bills. We'll see how it plays out at this final season of his rookie contract. Maybe the Bills and Cook can reach something either in season or at the very end of the season.
You know, there's a good question here in the chat and something that I think is important to talk about when it comes to the extension or possible extension of James Cook. And it's from Chris over on YouTube. Given that the cap increases every year, is $15 million an unreasonable ask? And I think it's interesting to think about it like that, because if you think about when this contract is going to go into effect for Cook, right? That $50 million number or whatever it ends up being, that probably first year salary cap number on the new deal is probably going to be in the bar. If they were to do 15, probably somewhere in the $10 to $12 million range from a cap hit perspective. Is that really going to be unreasonable at that time? Maybe not. The question that you have to ask yourself if you're the Bills and you're being responsible about the long-term build of this thing is, does James Cook do something that we can't find at a more cost-controlled number? So going out and maybe drafting a running back, resetting the clock on a rookie deal for somebody that, you think about where James Cook was found in the draft. I mean, after the 60th pick in the second round, this is a really talented running back class. So if you wanted to, I'm not saying you're looking to trade James Cook, but if you wanted to hypothetically move off of him, give him to a team that is going to give him an extension, maybe get some draft capital that can give you even more ammo in this class, you go use a pick in a deep running back class, and now you've restarted the clock, and maybe that's a better long-term plan for roster building. The one thing that we can't really know is, how much does James Cook mean to that locker room? How much would this be another example of rewarding a guy that, homegrown talent that you've drafted, you've developed, and then hoping to resign? And to your earlier point, the Bills have said they want James Cook in the mix long-term. It's just going to come down to whether or not it makes sense financially. I think he's a great running back. Do I think he's a top 5 running back in the league in terms of usage and production? I think that could be argued.
That's where I come in at it as well. It's, where does he rank overall? The home run hitting ability is there. The touchdowns were there this season, but it's the pass blocking. It's the 3 down back. It's a lot of the things that he doesn't quite do well enough. Where I do agree, maybe 15 million is not unreasonable, but it is unreasonable when you're already paying your quarterback a massive contract that averages about 55 million, and now you have Rousseau locked down, Shakir, Bernard. You have some older guys on bigger contracts as well. You have guys from previous years, Deion Dawkins, Spencer Brown on big deals. There's only so much money to go around if you want to stay healthy cap wise long term. So not everyone can get paid, unfortunately. And the running back position is one that teams have shown a willingness to let good players go, but then they're able to go out and find guys in the draft, in free agency at a much lower, cap hit or cap rate that can come in and contribute. And there might be a little bit of fall off short term if the Bills do let James Cook walk after the 2025 season and replace him with a rookie, and then Ray Davis is your top two. But in due time, that might be just as good of a combination as well. It's tough to juggle and manage.
Thank you so much for watching here on this Monday, a little early edition of Shout during the week. I'm down at the owners meeting, so getting access to Brandon and Sean over the last couple of days, I feel like has shed some light on potentially starting to put some of the puzzle pieces together. And, we mentioned how much, Brandon was direct talking about James Cook's contract. I think both guys have been open and honest about the need to still address the defensive line. And with free agency being at the place that it's at, most of the really good players have been picked through. I mean, if you think about it, if you're going to add another big-time defensive lineman in free agency, it's probably going to come closer to the start of the season as teams kind of move through some contract decisions, some salary cap decisions after the draft. Brandon Beane said it best. Like, when thinking about cornerback, defensive line, the best place this offseason remaining to add there is in the draft. And I asked Sean McDermott yesterday, you look at some of the pieces that have been around Ed Oliver, your building block on the interior over the last couple of years. It started with Star Lotulelei. It then went to Daquan Jones. Star at 315, Daquan at the highest that he's been at 320. Is it time to maybe move to a bigger player in that spot? And Sean McDermott was pretty forthright. He basically said, listen, considering the player that Ed Oliver is and the limitations, obviously from a size perspective, getting somebody bigger that can be that true space eater is something the Bills have had to think long and hard about this offseason. So now that kind of, you turn your attention to the draft and what that could ultimately mean. Those 330 plus pounders, whatever range of the draft that it makes sense, I think that that's in play. And I also think with the suspensions of Ogunjobi and Hoyt, we could be looking at a multiple defensive line approach in the draft. And maybe even if we come out of the first 2 days and the Bills have ended up drafting 3 defensive linemen, Ryan, it wouldn't surprise me.
No, not at all. And it's no surprise that a lot of the draft prospects that the Bills have been linked to are defensive linemen. Landon Jackson, edge rusher out of Arkansas, says he's probably talked to the Bills 8 times in the draft process. Joshua Farmer of Florida State says that he talks to the Bills every day. Probably an exaggeration on that one on his part, but he's talked to the Bills a lot. The Bills have been linked to multiple defensive tackles based on meetings that they've had at the Combine. Kenneth Grant's a name that they've been linked to, 100 times over in mock drafts. So whether the philosophy changes in terms of going after those 330 plus pound space eaters, or it's an undersized player like they've been doing with, Daquan Jones and company, I fully expect them to add another defensive tackle or two to this rotation, an edge rusher or two to this rotation. They have 10 picks right now, Matt. I think the vast majority of the picks are probably going to go on the defensive side of the ball. And like you said, when all is said and done, don't be surprised if there's a few D tackles added, maybe one more edge rusher. They have young guys waiting in the wings with a chance to really step up here based on the suspensions of Hoyt and Ogunjobi. But you also want to have extra ammunition there as well in terms of depth and rotation players.
Sean was asked today, actually, he did probably 45 minutes of media availability, met with the local media yesterday, and then followed up today with at the coach's breakfast, and he was asked twice about his plan with Ogunjobi and Hoyt, because you get all the way up to the start of the season, then you remove them from the situation. And we've talked a little bit about this already on the show. Like, it's going to be an opportunity for some younger players, but how do the Bills get them up to speed? Because the rest of the league, they're not waiting around. I mean, by week 7, you're going to have most teams kind of hitting on all cylinders, and you're going to, as a defense, have to interject 2 big time pieces. That's going to be interesting. So you have this opportunity to maybe try some things with some different players, see what you have in some different players. But then when Ogunjobi and Hoyt come back, the Bills are going to have to do their best to get them up to speed and integrate it in the defense. They did a pretty good job with it of Matt Milano last year, but I think there were growing pains there. And I think that's going to be something that they're going to have to deal with as a defense. It's going to be a big ask for Bobby Babich and his position coaches to get them to the spot where they need them to be. But that's a concern, and something that, depending on how the preseason goes, you wouldn't typically have these 2 guys playing a ton in the preseason, veterans that you went out and spent some money on in free agency. But I think for their purposes, you're going to see a lot of them in the preseason to kind of get an idea of what they need to be in this defense, but then also where they fit in for when they do return in week 7.
Right. It's a complicated juggling act because, like you said, you get up to the start of the regular season, they're out for 6 weeks. And then come, the end of their suspension, you got to get them thrown back into that rotation sooner rather than later. Ideally, the best thing that could happen for the Bills, Dwayne Carter steps up behind Ed Oliver, and then Ogunjobi kind of gets slow played in as that next man in that rotation, and you don't need to count on him for multiple reps. Same with Hoyt off the edge, Javon Solomon, AJ Epinesa. They do their part in his absence, and then it becomes a little bit easier. But the problem with that is that's no guarantee. We kind of already know the ceiling of an AJ Epinesa. Javon Solomon really flashed times last year, but who knows what that second-year leap looks like. And Carter, for the good moments that he had, there was a lot of time that he was inactive after that wrist injury. So there's so much uncertainty. And then you throw in the fact that these veterans are going to have to get mixed back in. It's a complicated process because there's probably going to be some practice squad elevation guys brought up during those first 6 weeks, however they figure it out. And it's going to be up to the Bills to manage that to the best of their ability, not to mention maybe adding more draft picks into the mix there. But I don't just think, Matt, it's going to be defensive linemen that the Bills address. We're sitting here well through the first and second wave of free agency. They haven't done much at the cornerback position. So what have we learned so far at the owners' meetings about the cornerback position?
I think that both Sean and Brandon have been upfront and honest about the fact that that's a position that's still maybe a little bit of a concern. And I think rightfully so. I think you got like guys with high floors and Dane Jackson and Jamarcus Ingram, but whose ceilings aren't that much higher than the floor that they come in and they give you. Without Rasul Douglas, and it appears by all the writing on the wall, that's not going to be in the cards long term. We'll see. And maybe there's absolutely no market for him. He's familiar with the defense. He spent a season and a half getting used to it. And the Bills are like, what, if no other veteran is, at least what you can get with Douglas on top of maybe addressing the position in the draft. So that gives you some type of comfort level. But to me, everything that they're saying is this is something going into the draft that they're going to have to address significantly with multiple picks. And so I was thinking about it. And so I asked Brandon Beane about, all right, you go back to the 2020 draft and cornerback was a big need. You came out after the fact and said you were feeling the pressure to go out and get a cornerback. You heard it from everybody, including the people that you saw at the gas station and the drugstore and the grocery store. And so you go up and you trade up for Kyrie Elam. What did you learn about addressing 2 positions or a position like that with 2 picks in the same draft? And he said, listen, I get the idea that might be the best approach, but you have to follow the board. If you go into a draft and you say, all right, I'm taking 2 cornerbacks, maybe you get to the 4th round and you're saying, I got a 5th or 6th round grade on this guy, but we know that it's a position of need. I'm going to take that guy. That's not an approach in the draft that is going to keep you successful in the league. Now, what he did say is when you have a position group like defensive tackle and you look at this class and it's so deep, what that's going to organically and naturally do is push a lot of defensive tackles up to the top of your list in each round because it's so plentiful at the position in the draft. So to me, outside of cornerback, I don't know if that is as plush with talent as defensive tackle is in this class as is running back. So I think it's much more likely that you see the Bills get really aggressive at defensive tackle in the draft and then really look to be aggressive with somebody that they like, particularly at any position in the draft. And that might be in the second, maybe it's a third round pick, right? Maybe the third round's going along, they get halfway through and they're like, wow, there's somebody sticking way out on the board, right? Kind of like Cole Bishop last year. That you have a second round grade on him and he's there available midway through the third round round, and you're sitting there with no third round pick, you move up to get back in to go get that guy because of what you need at the position. There's so many different scenarios, but again, as much as I think cornerback needs to be addressed in the draft, I think that they could figure out some things there. I would much prefer them use their aggressiveness and their draft capital to get multiple options at multiple positions on the defensive line.
Yeah, I think he learned a lesson in terms of how you can't, and they, I don't want to say learn a lesson. They know you can't reach for players in this league because, like you said, you'll be out of a job before long if that's what you keep doing, because needs over best player available is never the way to go about this. Now, when it comes to these different positions and players, I forgot I have a radio spot, Matt. I'll hold that thought for 1 minute.
All right, so Ryan's going over there to take a little radio spot, a little bit of a scheduling conflict right there. Ryan, come back to us. We'll get you back to that in about 3 or 4 minutes. I've done this before where I had a radio spot and I had to kind of put it off. We're always juggling a lot of things, especially this time of year with like the draft happening and everything like that. So sorry about that, buddy.
Yeah, no, that's my fault too. I forgot about it. I'm on hold right now, so I'll just kind of talk real quick while I'm waiting to go on. But I think that the Bills are going to go into this draft and they know that there's some defensive tackles that they can get in round 1, like a Kenneth Grant, in round 2 or round 3, like the Caldwell. There's so much depth there that they can go double dip there. Cornerback's not as plentiful in terms of the top end talent, but they can go out and find players of needs as well.
All right. That'll probably do it for this episode. We wanted to give you a quick hitter while I was in Palm Beach. We'll be back for our Staples show on Wednesday night. Don't forget the 2 big April dates. April 19th, live at Wingnuts on Millersport Highway. We're coming back for a live show. That's going to be our mock draft episode. We cannot wait for that. And then April 24th, the first night of the draft, we're going to be live at Turning Stone for the entirety of the first round. Come out, hang out. It's going to be a watch party. We're going to do a live show. It's going to be absolutely awesome. We'll see you on Wednesday. We cannot wait. Enjoy the rest of your week, everybody. Take care.